but this is a historical timeline of English language learners, or ELLs, by Alyssa Guzman. So the Nationality Act of 1906 is where we're going to begin. But before, just to give some small background knowledge, in the early 19th century, there was anywhere from 4 to 7% of U.S. elementary school children that were receiving part or all of their instruction in the German language. So, the Nationality Act of 1906 was passed because of this Americanized efforts idea that was started by the APA. So there would be a decrease in bilingual education. So Congress passes the first language legislation at a federal level. The students must speak English for naturalization, and it was a requirement. A huge supporter of this Americanized efforts was the Immigration Restriction League, which was formed by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts. He wanted to bar entry to any foreigner unable to pass a literary test. So in between the years 1917 and 1923, there was a lot going on. So the United States entered World War I in 1917, which created this popular belief to Americanize immigrants. And this idea received federal support. So states adopted emergency measures to restrict German usage. Also during this time period in 1919, 15 states enacted English-only instruction laws. Ohio bans any use of German in public schools, and in 1923, in the Meyer versus Nebraska case, the U.S. Supreme Court strikes down laws that restrict the teaching of foreign language. So this case was based on an act passed in 1919. It is reaffirmed that no person should teach any subject to any person in any language other than English, with the exception of dead language. And English was to be the mother tongue of the United States. So because so many students were speaking German and just other languages, they came up with this idea to just have English be the mother tongue, and this was a huge popular belief. So in 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education. So during this time, it was argued that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment was being violated. And it overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, which stated that racially segregated schools were okay as long as facilities were equal. But the court outlaws separate but equal in public schools with this case. And parents say that it is unequal to have students who struggle with English in mainstream classrooms. They thought submerging their children in classrooms for English background students, or that were built for English background students, meant unequal opportunities to succeed. And to support this claim, a large number of language minority students were failing and falling behind and dropping out of classes because they could not understand what was happening in the classroom because they weren't getting the support they needed. So in 1958, the National Defense Education Act was passed by Congress. It was passed in response to Sputnik, which was the satellite that showed the Soviet Union's early lead in the space exploration, just the Cold War things. So it was the first effort at a national level to strengthen our math skills, science skills, and foreign language instruction. The initial subsidies and requirements were modest. The federal role increased after Great Society reforms in the 1960s. So in 1963, the first modern bilingual education program was developed. It was a two-way bilingual program. It was made for Spanish-speaking and English-speaking children. and it was founded at Coral Way Elementary in Miami, Florida. This program was supported by a grant from the Ford Foundation, and it was supported and kind of found by Spanish-speaking Cubans and Anglos. They wanted their children to get the best schooling, so they went and made a way for their children to get better schooling. So in 1964, the Civil Rights Act, Title VI, was founded, and it prohibited discrimination against race, color, or national origin in federally assisted programs. So this was key legislation that helped improve schooling for ELLs. Even after this act was passed, it was still difficult to get everyone on board to help ELLs. Many people just had this notion that the United States was this big melting pot and that everyone wanted to be Americanized, which meant that they had to speak English, but for a lot of people, this wasn't correct. It was something where they saw a dream here and they wanted to come here, but they didn't want to have to change their entire culture to be able to live here in the United States. So in 1965, the ESEA was founded, and that is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It addressed academic needs for poor children, and it was instrumental in improving schooling for English learners. Although it was improved schooling for English language learners, it complicated the lines of authority among federal, state, and local officials over public education. So laws and regulations changed without much notice to stakeholders, so there was an uncertainty about schools' legal options and obligations serving LEP students. In 1968, the Bilingual Education Act was signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson. On January 2nd, it was the first commitment to assisting students with limited English skills. It authorized resources to support educational programs, train teachers and aides, develop instructional materials, and encourage parent involvement. It did not require schools to use languages other than English in order to get funding. It was also known as the Title VII of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and it was a federal policy for bilingual education. In 1974, Lau versus Nichols was a case suited by Chinese parents in San Francisco. The case originated in 1970. So Edward Simon was a poverty lawyer who took this case when he found out his client's child was falling behind and failing in school because he could not understand the language of instruction. Steinman filed this suit on behalf of his client's child and 1,789 other Chinese background students who were in this same situation. So after this, the Supreme Court ruled that identical education does not result in equal education under the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And Congress also passed the Equal Educational Opportunity Act. And then Lau remedies came. And Lau remedies were introduced on August 11th in 1975, which were guidelines on how to identify and evaluate children with limited English skills, appropriate instructional treatment, when children were ready for mainstream classrooms, and what professional standard teachers should meet. And in 1978, there was a Bilingual Program Act, and it was reauthorized. It was a language maintenance band, and it was funded restricted to transitional programs. And in 2001, the No Child Left Behind Act, Title III, was founded. It was federal funding for ELLs and immigrants, and it was a reauthorized version of the ESEA. It was updated and renamed by President George W. Bush, and Bush said, "We're going to spend more money, more resources, but they'll be directed at methods that work. Not feel-good methods, not sound-good methods, but methods that actually work. And these are my sources.